Good morning to everybody. Marhaba. First and foremost, thank you to His Highness Sheikh Hamdan and His Excellency Mohammed Al Gargawi for hosting us and for hosting this event and for their global leadership in foresight. We don't see much leadership in foresight among our world leaders, and it really is an inspiration to see that leadership in action. I'd also like to thank His Excellency Omar Sultan Al Olama for his leadership in the field of artificial intelligence and the digital economy. I had the opportunity to meet you a few years ago at the first AI conference. It's really stunning, all of the leadership that you're showing in that arena. And I'd like for all of us to just take a moment and look around this room. And look who's here. And look at this magnificent building. I have been to Dubai many times, and I've watched this building as it was being built. This is the museum of the future, but really, it's a call to action for us all to be planning for and thinking about the future. So the script on this building are actually quotes from His Highness Sheikh Mohammed Al-Rashid Al Maktoum, and I'll just paraphrase a few of them. The world doesn't wait. We make our own futures. This is a visible reminder to everybody who sees this building to really be thinking about and planning for the future. So here we are. It is an absolute privilege to be here and to have this opportunity to talk to you about foresight. I know many of you already. For those of you I haven't had the opportunity to meet, here are 3 quick things I usually tell about myself. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the Future Today Institute. FTI specializes in evidence-based, data-driven, very long-range scenario planning. Probably many of you know us because of our annual Tech Trends report. We focus on technology and science, but we actually work with all different types of organizations and disciplines around the world. The second thing about me is that most of my time is spent advising the senior leadership of all different types of organizations, both in the private sector and the public sector. So I have a horizontal view into what's happening. I know where our leaders are misplacing their attention. I know where blind spots are. I know where there is opportunity. And a lot of what I'm going to talk to you today about is I know the challenges these folks are facing, and particularly what foresight is and is not accomplishing in both government and the private sector. Third, and I mean this sincerely, I am your biggest fan. You did not become a futurist because it's a cool-sounding job. You're a futurist because you care deeply about tomorrow. A lot of people have no idea what we do. They think we're professional speech makers. They think we're a little crazy. But as all of you know, this work, when it's done well, it can be tedious. It's not very glamorous. You know, you're sitting in a room by yourself crunching numbers, or you're in a workshop trying to get people to sort of come along with you on a thinking journey. This is difficult work. You are here because of a calling that you answered. So I deeply admire you. I admire you and your dedication in all of the work that you're doing. Now, 3 quick things about you. If it's not already abundantly clear, you are currently sitting at the epicenter of foresight on the planet. If you're not familiar with Dubai's history, you heard a little bit about it just a moment ago, but in the mid-1800s, this was a fishing village. The leader at that time, Maktoum bin Bouti, saw a future where trade and commerce could turn that village into a thriving global community. He was doing crazy things at the time. He granted tax exemptions for foreigners. There was an active welcoming of foreigners into the community. You just heard that there are over 200 nationalities represented here. And when oil was discovered, Dubai's leaders didn't just stop and say, we're rich now, everything's going to be great. Instead, they developed an ambitious, long-term vision for social projects and economic development. We just don't see this anywhere else like we do here. That commitment to foresight resulted in one of the world's most vibrant cities with one of the most progressive societies in the entire region, one that is dedicated to thinking about long-term futures. So that is modern-day Dubai and where we are right now. If this is your first time here, there are lots of things to see, but in particular, the Sheikh Mohammed Center for Cultural Understanding is a really great way to see this story in action, as well as the historic village that you heard a little bit about earlier. But just, again, it's not just a single thing that's happening. This isn't just a temporary meeting for futurists. We're here, literally, living inside of somebody's scenario for what the future could look like. Second, about you, you think expansively, orthogonally, and that's very, very hard to do. So you are skilled at both thinking near-term and long-term simultaneously. Finally, I believe that you are vanguards. You are vanguards of foresight and of ushering in new eras for the entire world. And that's important because foresight has never been more important before than it is right now. And that's because we are all living through a soul-crushing amount of deep uncertainty. We are facing at some point, we're facing uncertainty in the presentation. We are facing huge problems, there we go, with our central banks. Actually, this is a really good metaphor for what's happening right now. The central banks, which are normally the cause for stability, have themselves become the source of instability. The Federal Reserve in the United States has raised interest rates 5 times so far this year to combat inflation, which is, again, I understand why we're doing that, but what are the next order impacts? Foresight would be useful as we're thinking this through, because there's been a spillover effect to other central banks. They're being forced to raise their interest rates. Inflation isn't coming down, prices are still high, and consumers don't have enough personal liquidity to get what they need in many places around the world. So we're looking at challenges with inflation and a global downturn this year, and probably recession in many parts of the world next. This has got people really concerned. There are additional macro forces, and that has to do with, so as I'm continuing to talk, I seem to have lost some connectivity with this. If somebody in the back can, I'm just going to keep going, but I can't advance. The other forces have to do with Putin and Biden. You know, we're suddenly hearing about the threat of potential nuclear conflict. I was a kid in the 1980s, and I remember what it was like to live through the Cold War, or the last parts of the Cold War, and really being concerned about nuclear Armageddon. I don't want to go through that again, and yet here we are. So we're facing financial macro forces, we're facing geopolitical macro forces, and I really could use some help. So we're facing all different types of forces, and in addition to all of that, we've got the challenges of technology. So you're going to hear today and tomorrow about lots of emerging tech trends. You're going to hear about artificial intelligence and synthetic biology and the digital economy from your fellow futurists who are in attendance. And for us, these are interesting ideas and interesting things, but to the outside world, these represent huge sources of change, and people are really concerned about that. If somebody can, I don't want to keep stopping, but I also have to keep advancing somehow. So here's the issue. The problem with macro forces and technology trends combined together is causing FOMO on a grand scale, the fear of missing out. And so what's happening is people are making bad decision after bad decision. In other cases, this is leading to no decisions whatsoever, and that also is causing a problem. Next slide, please. So we have a problem. Foresight, we literally have a problem. This is no criticism of that tech team back there. Is actually pretty great. I think it might be a clicker issue. So foresight has never been more important, and yet, this was the dramatic impact point. I don't think that foresight is having the impact that it needs to have. We are all here, and we want to have that impact, but externally, I think if we really asked ourselves, are we having the impact we want to have, the answer would probably be no. All right, if the answer was that we are all doing a great job and foresight really is embedded in how people think, we wouldn't be facing global climate change. There would be issues, but the catastrophe that's looming probably would not have gotten to this point because there would have not just been scenarios about climate change, there would have been action that followed. We wouldn't at this point be dealing with advanced surveillance capitalism already in the metaverse, which is just in the process of launching. And companies and governments, they've already started hiring chief metaverse officers. Okay? Yeah, whoever laughed? Yes. We already have chief metaverse officers, and that's fine, but here's the problem I have with that. We don't have chief foresight officers. And the people who work in strategy are really focused near term. Foresight leaders do not often have a seat at the executive table, and I am usually in the rooms when those meetings are happening with executives. And foresight leaders within their own companies are typically not there. This is a strong signal, okay? Dubai is a rare exception where foresight is very much a part of government and executive level decision making, but we don't see this in a lot of other places. This is a strong signal that our work, which is vital, isn't having the impact that it should. If foresight was making an impact, leaders would be more comfortable with uncertainty, volatility, complexity, and ambiguity. They would lean into those VUCA forces with curiosity and the intent to come out of that better. They would think the unthinkable. They would do that voluntarily, and they would create strategy for mitigation and growth. I know many of you very well. Policy Horizons in Canada is here. The work is legendary on a global scale for impacting governments in Canada, but also governments worldwide. Andrew Blau is here. He helped build GBN. Mick Costigan is also here. There's a huge GBN diaspora, which has had immeasurable immeasurable influence on foresight, and how it's been practiced in business, and how it continues to spread. So all of you, all of your work, I know it's well-researched, it's creative, it's interesting, and I don't think you are the problem. I'm going to tell you what the problem is. The problem is more complex than that. Something is wrong, because if we're all doing a great job, and foresight is not leading to the type of actions that we needed to have, then there's some type of disconnect. So I have a theory on what that is, and how to solve it, and how foresight must evolve. Okay, and so I want to do this by looking at three lenses: government, business, and society. So let's start with government. So what are the jobs of government in any country, anywhere around the world? The government needs to do a few things. Governments need to give behavior parameters for citizens in the forms of laws and regulations. Governments need to protect citizens from harm. And government, in my view, should provide for people's well-being and happiness. Those are the jobs of government, okay? Now, these are the challenges. If we go into the future, to the year 2071, what are the emerging trends, the macro forces, and other signals that are forming today that might prevent government from doing those jobs in the futures? There are things like the changing needs of citizens, evolving or novel threats, and factors that prevent well-being and happiness, right? So now let's think about foresight work in the government. So government foresight, again, this is just my opinion, and this is not always universal, but from my opinion, government foresight work tends to focus on risk, okay? Risk-focused scenarios comment on the job of government, but it's really hard to see what action to take on risk other than, let's not do that. I think the problem is that our expectation of foresight and the government's practical use cases for foresight are not harmonized. So there's a delta, a gap, that needs to get resolved. Government foresight initiatives, they tend to lead to white papers and reports and policy recommendations, again, which are good. However, it's difficult to extract from that a plan for meaningful, durable, long-term action. And that's because a lot of times this work is not addressing the jobs of government and directly answering the future challenges that it'll face. It's interesting that we're in Dubai thinking about all of this because this is a rare exception to that rule. But if I look at a lot of other governments in a lot of countries around the world, this is not what's happening. White papers, reports, policy recommendations, we have to figure out a way to make Foresight positioned so that government leaders can fulfill their own jobs. Okay, so that's government. Business is next. So what's the job of business? A business needs to create value for customers using its products and services. And a business needs to create and to sustain profit. So again, if we go into the future, what are the emerging tech trends? What are the macro forces, other signals that are forming today that are going to prevent business from doing its jobs in the future? Things like disruption to to value creation models, ecosystem players that are not margin constrained, meaning they can make big bets and spend money in other places to crush existing incumbents. There are barriers to talent acquisition and retention, geopolitical disruption, regulation, right? I can go on and on. So I have an observation, and my observation is actually not my observation. It comes from my absolutely brilliant colleague at FTI, Melanie Subin. We were talking the other day, and she said, scenarios pose a challenge to leaders of companies because lately there's not a lot of psychological safety inside of companies. There are crushing forces that are really causing new types of competition. People are really concerned, they're scared, they're vulnerable. So it's hard to be challenged in a public setting or even in a setting with colleagues. There isn't a lot of psychological safety to explore those jobs of business and the challenges of business. Executives might say that they want an outside-in perspective. I get asked this all the time. But in reality, they don't feel safe to explore those scenarios. One of the key components of what we do is rehearsing the futures. That's increasingly challenging inside of organizations. Our work cannot simply exist to reinforce cherished beliefs inside an organization. That's not what futurists should be doing. And we should not be making our clients feel like they're doing the right thing if we know that they aren't, which is why in the private sector, trends tend to be valued over scenarios. I know this better than anybody because the Future Today Institute researches throughout the year 600 or so longitudinal tech trends. And we produce an annual report in March that's downloaded like 1 million times. So I know that everybody likes trends. Everybody wants to know the next tech trends. Business leaders, teams, they like trend reports. That's because trend reports are not threatening. They're easy to ignore. They don't demand immediate action. Trends are an easier sell in the private sector than scenarios. And scenarios force executives to really think about and focus on their futures. And that is a hard thing to do these days. In business, P&Ls, quarterly reports, they act like attentional boomerangs, right? So we can show them a scenario, we can ask them about their next order implications, but it's very easy for them to lose focus on those scenarios and on rehearsing the futures when they're also trying to meet their quarterlies, which is more and more challenging to do these days. So what happens is that a really successful Foresight workshop tends to get forgotten. The next steps, they tend to get pushed off. And scenarios fail to have the impact that they should because of this boomerang effect. The third lens on why I think Foresight doesn't have the impact that it should be having is society. What are the jobs of society? Society needs to enable its members to benefit in ways that would otherwise be difficult if people were acting as individuals. Society needs to feel safe and secure. And society needs to promote a good and happy life for its members. So again, if we play this forward, given what we know to be true today, what forces, signals, and trends will change our society. Diminished trust in our institutions, diminished belief in the value proposition of community, of society, of government, apathy toward public service. This is a big one. We have fewer and fewer young people willing to commit to public service in some kind of way because it doesn't feel like they're obligated to do so. New existential threats. Some of us are already thinking about these, but there are certainly threats we haven't even thought about yet. And importantly, a perceived loss of agency in living a good and happy life. Now, the problem is that for the most part, I've only got 30 minutes with